when man fought machine and machines won.
Your favorite fizzy drinks at a fraction of the cost.
Soda stream.
With Isotoner gloves.
Way to go.
What if the 1980s weren't just bold, but brilliantly bad? This was the decade of wild ideas, huge promises, and some of the strangest failures ever made. Rewind the cassette, grab a soda, and let us jump into items from the 1980s that failed harder than anyone expected. It looked like something straight out of a haunted dollhouse and somehow got greenlit as a beauty product. The Rejuvenique face mask promised younger, firmer skin through electrical muscle stimulation, which is a fancy way of saying it zapped your face with little shocks. Advertised by a former soap opera star, the mask wrapped around your head like a plastic exoskeleton and turned your facial routine into something that felt like a scene from a horror film. The idea was that the stimulation would tone your face like a gym tones your body, but customers mostly reported mild burns, numbness, and the distinct feeling that they had made a terrible mistake. Despite airing on television with the enthusiasm of a late-night miracle cure, it flopped hard. It was the kind of product that felt less like a beauty tool and more like a sci-fi movie prop that somehow escaped the set. Still, you had to admire the ambition. If you could survive the Rejuvenique, surely you could survive anything the 1980s had to throw at you. And as it turns out, that next throw was straight at the kids, because someone thought gym fashion should start in elementary school. Muscle pants for kids, that was the pitch. Somewhere, a grown-up looked at a child and said, "You know what this kid needs? Pants that scream steroid energy." These were Zubaz-style leggings with wild patterns and stretch material designed to mimic the bodybuilding look of adult gym rats. Except they were made for children. The problem was not just the patterns, which, by the way, included everything from neon zebra stripes to camouflage lightning bolts. It was that kids had no idea how to wear them. The pants were often too tight or too loose, and they came with this weird fake athletic vibe that clashed hard with the Sesame Street lunchboxes. These pants were a hard no. Schools started quietly banning them for being distracting, and parents got tired of explaining to teachers that no, their child was not training for a junior weightlifting championship. They were just victims of 1980s fashion. The trend came and went faster than you could say bicep curl. But speaking of trying too hard to look futuristic, let us talk about the time Atari thought your forehead could play video games. The Atari MindLink sounds like something a supervillain would use to take over the world, but in reality, it was a headband, a plastic one, that claimed to read your thoughts and turn them into in-game controls. The promise was simple: no hands, no controllers, just your mind. And that promise immediately hit a brick wall called 1980s science. The MindLink was supposed to pick up electrical signals from your forehead muscles and translate them into commands. In practice, that meant you had to clench and twitch your brow in weird ways to move a pixel around the screen. The truth was that the MindLink was way ahead of its time, and not in a good way. It launched into testing and was quickly shelved when even Atari realized nobody wanted to win Space Invaders with their eyebrows. Maybe it would have worked better as a meditation trainer or a fancy headache inducer. Either way, the MindLink was canceled before it ever hit store shelves, and thank goodness, because if it had gone mainstream, we might all be sitting in silence, furrowing our brows to check email. Now let us move from mind control to media meltdown with a television icon who could not quite make the jump from cool to coherent. Max Headroom was supposed to be the future, a computer-generated, sarcastic television host who stuttered stylishly and wore sunglasses at night. He was the face of a dystopian digital world, equal parts cyberpunk icon and artificial intelligence with an attitude. Advertisers loved him, especially soda companies. So someone had the bright idea: let us give him a full television series. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. The Max Headroom show was visually interesting but narratively confusing. It tried to blend science fiction with satire, wrapped in glitchy editing and background noise. Most of the time, you were not sure if the show was broken or just being artsy. The plotline featured underground hackers, corrupt corporations, and a bleak media landscape, which ironically kind of predicted the internet. And Max, once a futuristic face of advertising, became more of a trivia answer at bar night. Still, his influence stuck around in weird ways. You can spot traces of Mac's Headroom in everything from video game villains to pop music videos. And if you thought that was sensory overload, wait until we talk about the time theaters tried to make movies smell like real life. Smell-o-vision is one of those ideas that never needed to come back, but the 1980s brought it back anyway. Originally dreamed up decades earlier, it was the concept of pumping scents into a movie theater to match what was happening on screen. Think popcorn, flowers, burning rubber, and maybe a little regret. In the 1980s, a few studios tried to revive the concept with updated tech. Scratch and sniff cards were handed out before showtime, promising a full sensory experience. Spoiler alert, the cards smelled like crayons, the timing was always off, and half the audience forgot to scratch anything at all. Even more ambitious theaters installed actual scent machines that pumped artificial smells through the air vents. Which, fun fact, is exactly how you make a whole crowd nauseous during an action scene. Smell-o-vision failed because, unlike sound or visuals, scent is wildly subjective. And when it is artificial, it just smells like someone spilled perfume on a couch cushion. And speaking of odd inventions that had their moment before quietly disappearing, let us talk about the time schools had to ban a certain wrist gadget that made kids feel like geniuses. There was a brief, glorious moment in the 1980s when being a math nerd actually made you cool, and that was all thanks to the digital calculator watch. You could do basic math right on your wrist. Addition, subtraction, maybe a little division if you were feeling wild. These watches were sleek, futuristic, and they gave kids the illusion of being a young computer genius. But the novelty wore off faster than a sticker on a locker. Teachers banned them from classrooms almost instantly. Kids were using them to cheat on math tests or just to show off during spelling bees. Parents got tired of replacing batteries, and school administrators were not thrilled with little kids clicking away during morning announcements. Plus, if you had even slightly chubby fingers, good luck hitting the right button. It was a gadget that promised convenience, but delivered mostly frustration and a few detention slips. And while that fad disappeared into backpacks and sock drawers, another 1980s product was trying way too hard to sell itself with big names and bigger commercials. But even with a football legend at the front, it still missed the catch. The 1980s really wanted men to care about gloves. Not work gloves, not winter gloves, but luxury comfort gloves. Enter Isotoner. They were supposed to be the Cadillac of handwear, sleek, stretchy, and backed by none other than Dan Marino himself. Yes, that Dan Marino. The glove was featured in ads where Marino would flash his hands like they were national treasures. The pitch was simple. Your hands deserve respect. The reality? Nobody was asking for this. These gloves were fine, but they were not revolutionary, and certainly not life-changing. Isotoner's massive ad campaign made the product feel overhyped and weirdly intimate. Like, why is Dan Marino caressing his own hands like that? It was one of those rare cases where the marketing machine worked too hard and ended up making the product feel silly. Plus, most people buying gloves in the 1980s were not doing it because of a sports endorsement. They were doing it because it was snowing. And if you think that is strange, just wait until we revisit one of the most dangerous playground toys to ever roll out of a toy aisle. Spoiler, it has no handles, no brakes, and absolutely no chill. Imagine a pogo stick and a balance board had a baby, and then forgot to teach it physics. That was the Pogo Ball, also known as the Lolo Ball, and it was one of the hottest toy trends of the 1980s. It looked like a rubber volleyball stuck inside a plastic disc, and the goal was simple. Stand on it and bounce. No handlebars, no foot straps, no guidance. Just you, your ankles, and a prayer. The commercials made it look effortless. Kids soaring through the air, spinning in place, landing cleanly like Olympic gymnasts. But in reality, most kids got 3 hops in before face-planting into the pavement. Maybe it was the challenge. Or maybe we just liked pretending we had a shot at being the first Pogo Ball pro athlete. Either way, the toy quietly disappeared after too many accident-prone afternoons. It went from next big thing to garage sale classic almost overnight. And if that product made no sense, get ready for a toy so random and out of left field, Not even He-Man fans knew what to do with it. The 1980s were He-Man's golden hour. The action figures, the cartoon, the castles, it all worked. Until it did not. Enter the Meteorbs. These were plastic eggs that transformed into robotic dinosaurs and beasts. Sounds cool in theory, right? Well, not exactly. They were a spin-off that nobody asked for and few even understood. The Meteorbs came from outer space, at least according to the convoluted lore. And while He-Man's universe already had a lot going on, alien egg animals were a stretch too far. The figures were small, hard to transform, and did not mesh well with the bulkier, sword-wielding He-Man figures. You had warriors and sorcerers, and then a plastic orb that turned into a knockoff dragon. But the excitement faded quickly when kids realized these were more awkward than awesome. They were like the Happy Meal version of Transformers, but with less movement and more confusion. Even die-hard fans of Eternia looked at them and said, "I'm good." And speaking of complicated toys with a high learning curve, let us talk about the interactive television show that thought kids were ready to join a live-action sci-fi war from their living room. Captain Power and the Soldiers of the Future. Even the title sounds like it is trying a little too hard. This was not just a show, it was an experience. It blended live-action television with interactive toys that could shoot and receive fire using light signals. The toys would respond to what was happening on screen. Miss a blast, lose points, hit a target, score. It was the 1980s equivalent of augmented reality. And for about 5 minutes, it felt revolutionary. But there was one small issue. It was unbelievably complicated. You needed the toys. You needed the right episodes. You needed everything lined up perfectly, or the experience just fell apart. Parents were not thrilled with having to buy an entire shelf of gear just to make the show playable. Kids got frustrated when their PowerJet XT7 refused to register a hit or randomly shut off mid-battle. The show itself was dark, overly serious, and way too intense for its age group. It felt like a war documentary with lasers. The toy-to-show synergy was ahead of its time, but far too messy to last. The dream of fusing television and toys never quite stuck the landing. But if you thought that was an ambitious media crossover, just wait until you hear about the time our favorite sarcastic alien tried to host his own late-night talk show. Alf was already pushing it. A sarcastic, wisecracking alien with a taste for cats and a flair for sitcom chaos. But somewhere between primetime success and pop culture overload, someone at the network thought, you know what this extraterrestrial needs? A late-night talk show. And thus, Alf's hit talk show was born. It aired in the early 2000s but carried every bit of that lingering 1980s energy. Awkward, loud, and trying way too hard to be relevant. Alf was seated behind a desk, conducting interviews with celebrities like he was the fuzzy, felt-lined love child of Johnny Carson and a stuffed animal from your attic. The jokes were mostly flat, the format was confusing, and the guests looked just as baffled as the audience. Nobody needed an alien talk show host, and certainly not one that looked like he was about to sell used cars in between segments. The show quietly vanished into the void, but Alf's attempt at late-night glory is still burned into the memory of anyone who stayed up past 11 p.m. with the remote in hand. And if Alf's fashion sense made you blink, wait until you see the workout gear that looked like it was designed by a highlighter. Before the age of sleek athleisure and breathable fabrics, the 1980s gave us Diaglo workout gear. It was made from fluorescent neoprene, yes, that same thick, stretchy material you find in wetsuits, and it covered every inch of your body like your thighs owed someone money. Neon pink, electric green, traffic cone orange, you name it. Someone wore it to aerobics. The idea was to be bold, vibrant, and energetic. The result was usually something closer to a walking safety vest. These outfits were all over workout tapes, with instructors bouncing around in skin-tight ensembles that squeaked when they stretched. It made you sweat like you were jogging inside a microwave, and when you put it on, you looked less like a fitness enthusiast and more like someone who got lost on their way to a roller disco. Yet people bought them in droves, because the commercials promised that if you wore Diaglo, You were serious about your health and your fashion. But let's be real, it was more punishment than performance. Eventually, the trend burned out when everyone realized looking like a glow stick was not worth passing out mid-jumping jack. But if you thought sweating in neon was uncomfortable, just wait until we get into a home appliance that fizzled out almost as fast as it carbonated. Literally. Before the modern era of fancy sparkling water brands and sleek soda makers, there was the original SodaStream countertop fizzer. This was not the streamlined, minimalist version we see today. No, the 1980s model looked more like a miniature science project. It was bulky, confusing, and came with pressurized canisters that made a loud hiss every time you tried to carbonate something. The promise was simple: make your own soda at home. No more store runs, no more lugging 2 liters. Just add water, flavor, fizz, and boom, you had cola. Or at least something that vaguely tasted like cola. Cleanup was half the experience. Worst of all, it just never felt fun. Once the novelty wore off, it ended up buried in a cupboard next to the popcorn machine and the electric knife sharpener. It became the go-to housewarming gift that stayed in its box. A product built on convenience, undone by inconvenience. And speaking of inconvenient ideas, let us now shift from drinks to drip. Because when Coca-Cola decided to make fashion a thing, it went flat faster than day-old soda. Yes, this really happened. Coca-Cola made clothes, as in actual clothing. Jackets, shirts, and sweatshirts plastered with the iconic Coca-Cola logo, sometimes in cursive so dramatic it looked like a roller coaster had crashed into a soda can. The Coke clothing line hit malls hard in the 1980s, banking on the brand's popularity in that sweet spot between streetwear and soda culture. The problem? Nobody really knew how to wear it. Were you supposed to match it with jeans, with joggers, with a giant can of Coca-Cola in hand for authenticity? You had to really love Coke, not just drink it, but live it. And for the majority of people, that was asking way too much. The line did okay for a hot second in teen catalogs and discount racks, but beyond that, total fizzle. It never became a lasting trend, and the clothes aged about as well as a soda left open on the counter. Retro charm can only go so far. And while we're on the subject of old-school gadgets trying to reinvent themselves, let us talk about the time Viewmaster thought it could compete with video games, and failed faster than you can say, click to turn. Everyone remembers the Viewmaster. You stuck in a circular slide reel, pointed it at a light source, and clicked through a magical little slideshow. It was wholesome, simple fun. So naturally, the 1980s had to mess with it. Enter the Viewmaster Interactive Vision Console, a chunky plastic beast that combined VHS tapes, a special controller, and painfully slow interactive features to digitize the old Viewmaster concept. Instead of flipping through slides of scenic landmarks or cartoon characters, you now had clunky educational videos and the occasional appearance from the Muppets. The console let you interact by answering questions or choosing what happened next. But let us be honest, it was laggy, boring, and the choices were so limited you felt more like a passive observer than an actual participant. The Muppets were great, but even they could not save this relic of bad timing and worse tech. It ended up collecting dust in closets and attics, right next to the unopened board games and broken light brights. And if you think that was a loud disappointment, just wait until you hear the home karaoke system that made neighbors knock on your door, for all the wrong reasons. Laserdisc karaoke machines for home use were the audio equivalent of bringing a jet engine to a dinner party. These bulky systems promised a high-tech singing experience complete with massive laserdiscs that looked like vinyl records from the future. They came with tiny microphones, video lyrics, and a catalog of songs that somehow made every living room feel like a karaoke bar at 2 a.m., and not in a good way. The disc-changing process was awkward. The song selection was dated even for the time, and the video footage that played behind the lyrics often looked like someone filmed it in a dentist's waiting room. The microphones were low quality, the volume controls were chaotic, and the speakers distorted your voice into a shrill echo that could wake the neighbors. And not in a fun, come join us way. They were expensive, heavy, and quickly became outdated once smaller, sleeker, and more user-friendly CD-based systems rolled in. But if you thought singing poorly to a crowd of annoyed relatives was bad, imagine trying to impress someone with your personality through perfume that matched your horoscope sign. Zodiac-inspired perfume sets had their 15 minutes of fame when New Age culture exploded across America in the 1980s. Suddenly, everything had to do with your astrological sign, your diet, your love life, and yes, even your smell. These perfume kits came packaged in elaborate boxes with swirling star charts and inspirational quotes. Each scent was carefully crafted to represent the energy of a specific sign. Aries got something spicy and bold. Pisces, soft and floral. Sagittarius, something that smelled like sandalwood met a vanilla candle in a crystal shop. It was all a little much. The problem? The scents were too specific. You could not just wear whatever. You were expected to commit to your zodiac scent like it was your spiritual destiny. And worst of all, the trend did not last. Once the New Age boom simmered down, so did the demand for Virgo body mist. The boxes were bulky, the fragrances had a short shelf life, and it turned out people would rather smell good than smell astrologically accurate. These perfume sets became novelty gifts and gag presents long before they were cleared from store shelves. But if you thought niche perfume was a strange mashup, let us take a seat literally in one of the worst household design ideas to ever blast soft rock from under your butt. Plastic furniture with built-in radios was peak. Just because we can does not mean we should. These chairs, stools, and side tables looked like props from a retro sci-fi movie. Hard plastic shells in off-white, beige, or faux wood grain, complete with embedded AM/FM radios. That's right, you could sit down and tune in at the same time. It sounded futuristic, it looked modern, and it absolutely flopped. Why? For starters, plastic furniture is not comfortable. Add speakers into the mix, and suddenly you are vibrating with every song. Not in a cool bass drop way either, more like your spine buzzing because someone turned up the Eagles. The sound quality was garbage. The controls were always in the most awkward places, on the armrest, under the cushion, or worse, on the back panel where you had to stand up just to switch stations. Static? Constant. Comfort? None. Functionality? Debatable at best. By the early 1990s, they were toast, relics of a design phase that tried too hard to be ahead of the curve. And speaking of trying way too hard, the 1980s gave us a movie adaptation that should have stayed on trading cards, and trust us, it was gross in more ways than one. The Garbage Pail Kids movie is the textbook example of a terrible idea being taken way too seriously. The trading cards were already controversial, gross-out humor, exaggerated features, bodily functions turned into punchlines. But they were iconic. So naturally, someone decided to turn them into a full-length feature film. And it was a mess. The characters were played by little people in horrifying animatronic masks that barely moved, giving every scene a nightmarish vibe. The plot? A vague attempt at a coming-of-age story with elements of science fiction and slapstick comedy, all of it soaked in questionable effects and even worse acting. Even die-hard fans of the cards walked out of theaters feeling like they had just lost a piece of their childhood. Critics called it one of the worst films ever made, and audiences agreed. It tanked at the box office, vanished from theaters, and was quietly swept under the rug. The only thing this movie managed to accomplish was proving that not all nostalgia belongs on the big screen. But if you think that was a bitter taste, just wait until we talk about a candy bar that tried to be classy and ended up at the bottom of the vending machine. The Hersheys Bar. None Bar wanted to be different. It was billed as a sophisticated chocolate bar, something a little more elevated than the usual candy aisle suspects. It had layers, literally. Chocolate wafers, peanuts, and a generous coating of milk chocolate. The idea was to offer a richer, more filling experience that still came in a wrapper. On paper, it sounded like a win. In reality, not so much. Bar None launched in 1987 with a big marketing push and fancy packaging, but it never found its audience. It was too heavy for a casual snack, too bland for a premium treat, and too confusing in name and branding to compete with heavyweights like Snickers and Kit Kat. And then came the reformulation. Hershey tried to save it by splitting the bar into two pieces and adding caramel. Instead of helping, it just made the whole thing feel clunky. The original fans were turned off. New customers were not impressed. Eventually, it was discontinued and became a weird footnote in Hershey's product catalog. But while Bar None melted away, another 1980s premium product was cracking under the pressure. Literally. Let us rewind to the fragile, overpriced world of crystal cassette tapes. Crystal cassette tapes were supposed to be the future of analog music. Marketed as sleek, high-performance, and ultra-premium, these transparent little beauties looked like they belonged in a sci-fi lab. You could literally see the magnetic tape inside, which somehow convinced everyone they sounded better. Audiophiles at the time were told these cassettes offered enhanced clarity, less hiss, and more durability. In practice? Not even close. The plastic casing was notoriously fragile. One accidental drop and you could say goodbye to your mixtape forever. It turns out, crystal was more about the aesthetic than the engineering. The quality inside the tape was no better than your average Maxell, and in some cases it was worse. The real appeal was how it looked, not how it played. People bought them to impress friends, but they never stuck around in collections for long. Once compact discs hit the market, crystal tapes became little more than brittle relics of a dying format. But if you thought fragile tapes were bad, imagine an entire game console that looked futuristic, sounded promising, and still got completely ignored by the kids who just wanted Mario. The Vectrex console was a bold move in the 1980s video game world. Unlike the pixel-heavy systems of the time, the Vectrex used actual vector graphics, sharp glowing lines that looked like something out of a laser light show. It even had its own built-in screen. No TV needed. Just plug it in and get ready to play. Sounds amazing, right? It was. But here's the problem. No one cared. By the time the Vectrex hit the market, kids were already hypnotized by the Nintendo Entertainment System. They wanted colorful worlds, scrolling levels, and plumbers with mustaches, not glowing stick figures and abstract space shooters. The games on Vectrex were limited, most of them variations of asteroids or obscure sci-fi themes. Sure, the graphics were cool, but the novelty wore off fast. The screen was small, the sound effects were harsh, and the controller felt clunky. Parents saw it as an oddball option in a sea of cheaper, more supported consoles. It also launched right before the video game crash of 1983, which meant whatever momentum it had was completely obliterated. The Vectrex became a footnote in gaming history, a system ahead of its time that arrived at exactly the wrong one. And if that was not weird enough, wait until you hear about the console that required roller skates and motion control before either of those things were cool or safe. LJN's Roller Rock console is one of those forgotten experiments that sounds made up. Imagine a video game system that tried to combine motion control, roller skating, and rock music into one magical living room experience. The result? A half-finished fever dream that never made it past prototype testing. Roller Rock was pitched as a full-body gaming experience. The player would wear special sensors and perform skating movements that the console would translate into on-screen actions. The idea was to groove through levels by mimicking real roller skating moves. The problem was that the tech just wasn't ready. The motion tracking was wildly inaccurate. You would lean left and the character would moonwalk into a wall. Try to spin and the game would freeze entirely. There were also major safety concerns. Encouraging kids to roller skate in a living room full of furniture was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Not to mention the price tag, which would have been astronomical for a system that barely worked. LJN quietly shelved the project and Roller Rock vanished into prototype limbo. But speaking of odd home products that overpromised and underdelivered, let us now turn our attention to a kitchen gadget that dried fruit and expectations into dust. Ronco had a knack for late-night infomercials that made even the most questionable products seem revolutionary. The Ronco Food Dehydrator was one of their greatest hits, or at least it looked like one. With its spinning trays, futuristic design, and cheerful narrators promising healthy snacks for the whole family, it seemed like a no-brainer. Who would not want to make their own jerky and dried fruit at home? But here is what actually happened. You would slice up some apples, maybe some bananas, and pop them into the dehydrator. Then, you waited and waited for 12 hours, sometimes more, and let us not forget the smell. That thing would turn your entire kitchen into a sauna of warm, slightly sour air. The cleaning process was tedious, the trays stained easily, and for all the effort, the store-bought snack still won out in taste and convenience. The dehydrator eventually found its final resting place in the back of cupboards and garage shelves everywhere, alongside the pasta makers and popcorn helmets. But while Ronco tried to win over your kitchen, Taco Bell was out here trying to win your heart, with a burger that nobody asked for and even fewer remembered. Taco Bell's Beefer. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1980s, Taco Bell took a big swing at the fast food burger world with a dish that was basically a sloppy Joe in a hamburger bun. They took their seasoned taco meat, threw it on a bun, maybe sprinkled some cheese, and hoped customers would go for it. Spoiler: they did not. The Beefer was confusing. Taco Bell had built its reputation on tacos, burritos, and nachos. Quick, affordable, Mexican-inspired food. A burger just felt like it belonged somewhere else entirely. Customers would roll up to the drive-thru expecting a taco combo and instead get hit with a messy pile of beef between bread. The taste wasn't terrible, but it was wildly unbalanced. Too salty, too greasy, and often falling apart before you got the wrapper open. It never really fit into the menu, and eventually it faded into obscurity. Today, the Beefer lives on only in food forums and throwback articles, a reminder that not every experiment deserves a comeback. But if you thought the Beefer was a branding misstep, just wait until you hear about the next big audiophile gimmick: cassette tapes so fragile they could snap before your favorite song even started. Literally. Community bonfires became a resourceful way to conserve fuel while providing heat for multiple families at once. These gatherings became the heart of social bonding in hard times. Neighbors pooled whatever they could find: fallen branches, scraps of wood, or anything that could safely burn, to stoke the flames and keep the cold at bay. Nature itself lent a helping hand in this practice. Rural areas, in particular, relied on the bounty of nearby forests for firewood, while urban neighborhoods made use of discarded pallets or lumber from construction sites. Frugality was the driving force. Why light 10 individual fires when one could do the job for an entire street? Families saved precious resources and, in the process, fostered a sense of camaraderie that made the hardships a little easier to bear. Songs were sung, stories were shared, and for a few hours, the biting cold seemed a little less harsh. Today, this collective effort teaches us the power of community in times of need. And let's face it, sharing a fire is way more fun than huddling solo by a space heater. During the Great Depression, staying warm often meant stacking blankets, not just one or two, but multiple layers of quilts and blankets to trap heat. This was an ingenious, straightforward approach to insulating beds without the luxury of central heating or thick comforters. Families would gather every piece of fabric they had: old woolen blankets, quilts passed down through generations, even makeshift covers like cloth sacks or tablecloths, creating a makeshift fortress against the cold. The frugality of this practice couldn't be overstated. Not only did it maximize the warmth of what little bedding they had, but it also ensured that nothing went to waste. Even worn-out or damaged blankets were patched together to create additional layers. The simple, layered bedding system was a resourceful solution, leveraging the power of insulation through fabric. Of course, the environment played a role here too. In rural areas, families often had to use what they could find, whether it was sheepskin or fabric scraps, to bolster their layers. This practice also encouraged community bonding. Family members would work together, adding layers to the beds and sharing stories late into the night, wrapped up in warmth and togetherness. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, you basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed, and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. Potato peel soup is another classic dish. Now, it's not just watermelons. People actually tried saving the peels and skins off of everything: apples, oranges, and even potatoes. It's because next to corn, things like these were the easiest food to get in the country around that time. Potato peels were especially necessary because they had an incredible amount of fiber in them, which meant that you would go a lot longer between your soup and the next meal. It helps keep your appetite low, and anything that did that during the Depression was something people really needed more and more of. Potato peel soup was a cost-effective and simple way to have some kind of sustenance on the table. All you needed was water and the peels. People would add basic seasonings like spices or salt and pepper, but it wouldn't really do all that much. Despite that, people still stuck to this like it was their bread and butter, because it was simply one of the cheapest meals you could have. Eating without worrying about how it's affecting your budget or your supplies is actual rest and relaxation, and that's something people were living without almost every day. Warm outdoors was a necessity. Families with limited resources couldn't afford heavy winter coats, so they got creative. One surprisingly effective solution was newspaper. Slipping sheets of it inside coats, under shirts, or even between socks and shoes provided an extra layer of insulation that trapped body heat. It was practical, cheap, and easy to find, even if it made crinkling noises with every step. This ingenuity stemmed from the fact that newspapers were widely available, even during tough times. People often saved every issue, not just for reading but for countless uses: insulation, wrapping food, or even patching drafty walls. Nature, too, played a role in this resourcefulness. By mimicking how animals insulate themselves, layering fur or feathers, families used newspaper to create their own version of thermal protection. Outdoor layering also, it highlighted the importance of family. Parents often made sure their kids were properly bundled up before braving the elements, turning layering into an act of care and protection. The sun. Capitalizing on every sunny moment, they would gather near windows to soak up the heat from the daylight. This wasn't just about enjoying a bit of sunshine, but also a strategy to stay warm and conserve fuel. By sitting close to the glass, people maximized the heat trapped inside, making the most of the sun's natural energy. The role of nature was clear. The sun, when it shone, became a vital part of home heating. On clear days, people would move furniture to optimize sunlight exposure, often taking turns to bask in the warmth. With homes built with larger windows in mind, especially in rural areas, this practice became a clever adaptation of the environment. This practice also fostered family togetherness. On sunny days, households would find themselves gathering in the same room, warming their bodies and spirits. Today, we can take a page from this frugality. Natural heat, though often overlooked in modern times, is still a powerful resource, reminding us that sometimes a little sunlight can go a long way, both in saving money and lifting spirits. When temperatures dropped, families during the Great Depression turned to hot, hearty meals to maintain body warmth. Soups, stews, and hearty one-pot meals were a practical way to fight off the cold. The kitchen, where the stove was the heart of the home, became a warm refuge from the winter chill. These meals were about making the most of every scrap. With limited resources, families stretched ingredients by making broth from bones or using whatever vegetables they had on hand. It's amazing how a little ingenuity could turn a pot of leftovers into something that could feed a whole family and still warm them up. When families had access to gardens or livestock, they could take full advantage of fresh, homegrown ingredients to create filling meals. In a time when resources were so limited, the importance of frugality couldn't be overstated. Gathering around the table for a warm meal was also a way to nourish the spirit. Families huddled together for warmth, sharing stories and making the most of what they had. Today, a warm meal can still do wonders, not only for our bodies but for our sense of connection with those we love. So the thing about Depression-era cooking was that it led people to places they never thought they'd go to. Previously, we actually discussed in detail how people started using all of the pig. What you probably didn't think was that this meant literally everything. Yes, even the feet. Pickled pig's feet were one of the best things to go for if we're talking about people who drew the short end of the stick during the Depression. Not all economic stress was equal. People that were living in urban hubs, especially the big-name states and cities, had it much better than local towns and rural populations that were struggling to keep going. These parts of the pig, often considered offal, were not sold at market rate prices, and usually were a lot cheaper than other cuts of meat. The thing with those cuts was that even if they were available, which they rarely were since they were also being rationed heavily, they'd leave quite a gap in your budget. Pickling the pig's feet with vinegar and taking advantage of its acidity meant that the meat lasted longer too, and that goes to show you how dedicated people were to getting as much use as they could out of everything they had. During the Great Depression, finding enough fuel to keep warm was no easy task. But people living through the hardship didn't sit idly by. They made use of whatever nature had to offer. Scraps of wood, fallen branches, or discarded building materials became valuable resources for heating homes. In rural areas, families would regularly head out to gather firewood from the forest floor, while urban dwellers scavenged through construction sites or abandoned buildings for usable scraps. The ingenuity of these families was remarkable. They knew that every piece of wood could serve a purpose, whether it was used for cooking or simply keeping the house warm. The environment played a huge role in this process. Forests were often the go-to for firewood in rural regions, while in cities, abandoned lots and old fences were repurposed. And it wasn't only the adults who got involved, children helped too, making this a family affair that brought everyone together for a common goal. As modern society grapples with waste and environmental concerns, the Depression-era practice of collecting scrap wood offers a powerful reminder of just how far a little resourcefulness can go in warming both hearts and homes. Layering clothes. It's a strategy that's as old as winter itself. And during the Great Depression, it was a matter of survival. With limited resources and little heat to spare, families relied on the simple yet effective practice of layering to trap as much body heat as possible. By donning multiple shirts, sweaters, and even coats, they created insulating barriers that helped fend off the cold. Layering was a real lesson in resourcefulness. People would often repurpose old, worn-out garments using whatever they had. A woolen sweater passed down through the generations, a flannel shirt salvaged from a relative. These garments were vital tools in the battle against winter. This strategy speaks volumes about the adaptability and frugality of the time. Nature and the environment also played a role. When it was too cold to go outside, families gathered in smaller rooms and made do with the warmth of their own bodies, sharing the space in a way that encouraged both survival and closeness. Today, we have the luxury of high-tech fabrics and insulation, but perhaps there's a lesson to be learned here. Sometimes, staying warm is more about what you have around you than what you don't. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, The boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Salt pork and milk gravy is something that was European, both in tradition and concept. You might wonder how something like that ends up on a list of the most popular things to eat when you have no money, right? Well, that has to do with how communal the country became during the Depression. You've only grown up hearing the phrase, "love thy neighbor." These people? They lived a traumatizing decade following that to the letter. See, many people had to reach out to the communities that were present in America and learn new ways of cooking, new recipes, and new ways to save costs and stretch supplies to last longer. That's how dishes like these started to become popular. The idea of salting your pork was something that people took to immediately because of how much it helped to preserve food, and this was doubly true for places that never ever had any source of preservation or where meat was hard to come by. Lots of people made do with the ingredients they had on hand, but as far as peasant food went, this was one of the more versatile and filling options to go for. When store-bought clothes and blankets were out of reach for many families, the motto was simple: use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Old coats, curtains, and even burlap sacks were given new life as warm clothing or quilts. Worn-out trousers became patchwork blankets, while burlap sacks, sometimes dyed or embroidered, were transformed into dresses, aprons, or mittens. It was practical creativity at its finest, proving that fashion can indeed be forged from function. This was an art form born out of necessity. Many families turned to sewing and mending as a way to keep warm, using skills passed down through generations. A tattered curtain might be stitched into a winter coat, and an old coat's lining could become insulation for a quilt. Even the natural environment played a part. Burlap sacks, used to transport grains and produce, became a staple for rural families. This practice also brought families together. Children learned to sew alongside their parents, sharing in the process of turning scraps into survival. Today, the idea of upcycling fabrics has come full circle, with modern sustainability movements embracing what Depression-era families mastered out of sheer necessity. It turns out, the original thrift store chic was just a warm hug in disguise. When winters were unforgiving and fuel was a luxury, communities during the Great Depression found warmth in numbers. Wood-burning stoves were the heart of many homes during the Great Depression, providing both heat and a means to cook, and they were essential. Families could cook meals, boil water, and keep the house warm, all with one reliable appliance. It's efficiency at its best, and no one could argue with that kind of multitasking. The resourcefulness of families during this time was astounding. People gathered firewood from their own properties or local woods, sometimes trading for it if they didn't have enough. This reliance on natural resources helped reduce expenses, especially since a stove could burn nearly anything, from logs to smaller twigs. If it burned, it could be used. In a time where every penny counted, wood-burning stoves were the ultimate example of frugality. These stoves were also an anchor for family life, as many families gathered around them in the evenings, sharing stories or playing games to stay warm. Fast forward to today, and we could still learn a thing or two from the past. Wood-burning stoves may seem old-fashioned, but they're also incredibly sustainable. Immigrant ingenuity often gave rise to some of America's most beloved comfort foods, and this one is no exception. Born from German-American kitchens, Gheta is a hearty breakfast staple that combines pork, beef, steel-cut oats, and spices into a savory sausage loaf. Its roots trace back to German immigrants in Cincinnati, Ohio, who adapted their traditional Grützwurst to the ingredients available in their new homeland. Stretching meat with oats made it more affordable while adding a unique, satisfying texture. Families would fry up slices of this loaf to serve alongside eggs, creating a breakfast that was not only filling but economical. Over time, it became a regional specialty, so beloved that it inspired annual festivals like the Glier's Gheta Fest, celebrating this humble yet delicious creation. Cincinnatians consume over 1 million pounds of Gheta annually. That's enough to make you wonder if oats might secretly be the city's fuel. What sets Gheta apart is its slow-cooked process. which allows the spices to meld with the oats and meat, creating a flavor that's savory, earthy, and utterly distinct. Few dishes capture the spirit of thrift and indulgence quite like a warm, wilted lettuce salad. It's a combination that's both practical and unexpectedly decadent. A bed of fresh lettuce gently softened by a hot bacon fat dressing. If that doesn't sound like a love letter to resourcefulness, what does? This dish traces its roots back to rural American kitchens, where wasting food was unthinkable. When lettuce was abundant and bacon fat was too valuable to discard, clever cooks turned to this ingenious recipe. The heat from the dressing slightly wilts the greens, creating a tender, flavorful base. The addition of crumbled bacon, a splash of vinegar, and sometimes a sprinkle of sugar made it a savory, sweet masterpiece. The magic of this salad lies in its balance. It's humble yet rich, fresh yet comforting. It transformed humble greens into something hearty and satisfying, a rare feat for a salad in those days. Variations of this recipe can be found across different cultures, proving that the idea of combining warm fats with greens is truly universal. In a time when every resource counted, wilted lettuce salad turned a simple garden harvest into a dish worthy of the family table. Turned to an age-old practice, making charcoal. By slowly burning wood scraps in a low-oxygen environment, they could create a versatile and efficient source of heat. This was an ingenious way to stretch limited resources. Wood scraps, which might have otherwise gone to waste, were transformed into charcoal that could heat homes and cook meals. In a time when every penny counted, this dual-purpose fuel was a game-changer. The process wasn't simple, though. It often required digging a small pit or using a metal container to carefully control the burning. Too much oxygen, and the wood would burn to ash. Too little, and it wouldn't transform properly. Yet families who mastered this art ensured they had a steady supply of heat, even during the coldest nights. For rural communities surrounded by forests, this practice was especially common, blending human ingenuity with nature's resources. The communal aspect of this method can't be overlooked. Neighbors often shared tips and even batches of charcoal, proving once again that survival wasn't just an individual effort, it was a team sport. In the biting cold of the Great Depression, one of the most resourceful ways families stayed warm was by knitting wool garments. With wool being a readily available material, especially in rural areas, it became the go-to fabric for homemade sweaters, socks, mittens, and scarves. Women, in particular, would spend long hours by the fire, knitting these essential items, ensuring that every family member stayed warm throughout the harsh winters. Families understood that keeping warm meant more than layering clothes. It was about creating durable, long-lasting garments that could endure for years. Wool was naturally insulating, making it a perfect choice, especially in times when every penny counted. The environment played a role too. Wool was locally sourced, often from the family's own sheep or purchased from nearby farms, minimizing the need for expensive store-bought clothing. Neighboring women would often come together to share knitting techniques, trade yarn, and even swap finished items. It was as much about connection as it was about practicality. In today's world of fast fashion, we can take a cue from these Depression-era families. Sometimes, the best way to stay warm isn't to buy it, but to make it. Oil lamps were a common fixture in Depression-era homes, offering a source of light and a little bit of warmth during the cold months. Though not an extravagant solution, the oil lamp was indispensable, especially in the absence of reliable electricity. Families were resourceful, using every bit of available oil, sometimes repurposing cooking oil or fat drippings from meat to fuel these humble devices. While their primary role was providing light, the heat generated by the flame wasn't completely useless. In fact, a small lamp could take the edge off the chill in a drafty room, making it a dual-purpose household item. It wasn't a game-changer for warmth, but in a time of scarcity, every little bit counted. The environment played its part too. Lamp oil could be found or made at home with what nature provided, especially in rural areas. And of course, the practice of conservation was ingrained in daily life as families made sure to only light lamps when necessary, keeping them trimmed and well-maintained to extend their lifespan. They represent a time when families made the most of what they had, and those same practices of conservation and ingenuity continue to inspire us today, showing how little we really need to get by. Have you ever heard about coffee soup? Sounds like a fever dream, right? Yet that's exactly what it is. A soup made with coffee. As offensive to your familiar taste buds as that sounds, hear me out. You take some coffee, scraps of bread, and sometimes mineral or brown sugar and milk, and then you'd brew the coffee. Then you'd mix in those pieces of bread in the hot coffee and add whatever sweeteners and spices you had, and that was pretty much that. They call it a soup, but in practice it's more like coffee with extra steps, really. Still, it was a far better use of your cup of joe than just drinking it plainly. This way, you could get carbs in the form of bread, some much-needed glucose from sugar to help keep your brain running, you got your daily hit of caffeine, and the spices would help keep you active. People didn't look at food the same way we did back then, which is why some of these dishes might seem really outlandish to you. We look at food and think about pleasure, fulfillment, and what suits our tastes. They'd look at food and think about sustenance and practicality. How much can we get out of this? What can we get out of this? That kind of thinking led to people trying things we'd never think of today. During the toughest times in American history, the ability to turn scraps into sustenance was nothing short of a survival skill. Enter the humble yet hearty slumgullion, a stew that thrived on resourcefulness. Born from the need to stretch ingredients, it was often made with whatever was on hand: potatoes, leftover meat, vegetables, and sometimes a dash of seasoning if you were lucky. It was less about following a recipe and more about making do with what you had. The name slumgullion likely originated from 19th century mining camps, where the dish was cobbled together from bits and pieces miners could scavenge. The word itself might have started as slang for something watery or of questionable quality, though anyone who's had a well-made version would argue it's far better than the name suggests. Think of it as the original clean out the fridge meal, but with a lot more soul. It was filling, nutritious, and most importantly, affordable. And if someone complained about what was in it, well, they were promptly reminded that beggars couldn't be choosers. Slumgullion was a testament to the ingenuity and determination of those who faced hardship with a pot, a fire, and a whole lot of grit. A dish born of necessity but remembered for its practicality and hardiness. Homemade insulation became a popular and clever fix. Families used newspapers, old rags, cardboard, and even scrap fabric to seal windows, doors, and walls. The goal was simple: keep the warmth in and the chill out. Newspaper, in particular, became a go-to material, as it was inexpensive and abundant, often found piled up in every corner of the house. The ingenuity behind this practice is impressive. People repurposed anything they could find, even turning old coat linings into makeshift window covers. In rural areas, nature contributed with extra layers of hay or straw for insulation, often packed around window frames or used in the walls of barns. These methods were not only about conserving heat, they were about making every inch of the home as efficient as possible. Families worked together, tackling one drafty room at a time, bonding over shared tasks in the process. Today, this frugality is a reminder that sometimes the most resourceful solutions are the simplest, and often the most effective. In fact, homemade insulation is still a viable option in areas where modern insulation can be costly. In a time when heating was expensive and resources were scarce, families during the Great Depression turned to a natural, free source of warmth. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness often meant making every calorie of energy and every bit of heat work double duty. The fireless cooker was a brilliant example of this efficiency. Families would heat up a pot of food on the stove, then transfer it still hot into a homemade insulated container packed with blankets, hay, or even straw. The retained heat would finish cooking the meal, saving precious fuel while keeping the container, and often the surrounding area, warm for hours. It was like an early version of the slow cooker, but without the plug. This was a nod to the ingenuity of the time. Fuel was scarce, so using retained heat allowed families to stretch their resources as far as possible. It also had a touch of environmental awareness, though not by choice. By conserving wood or coal, people were unintentionally embracing sustainability long before it became a buzzword. These makeshift cookers also created moments of togetherness. Families would gather around the fireless cooker, eagerly waiting for a warm stew or porridge to be ready. Today, it's a reminder of how creative problem-solving and a little teamwork can go a long way. Plus, who wouldn't appreciate a kitchen hack that saves money and keeps you warm? If you remember any of these flops or owned one, tell us in the comments and hit like. Subscribe for more blasts from the past that probably should have stayed there. If you remember any of these flops or owned one, tell us in the comments and hit like. Subscribe for more blasts from the past that probably should have stayed there.